right. So as I say, we are just at the end of the 4th century. Last time we looked at the man who was probably the major character dominating 4th century history, who was Athanasius. And so we looked at his life, noting that Athanasius was the one who more or less single-handedly held off the effects, the challenges that came by virtue of the Arian heresy, which had indeed provoked the Nicene Council, but which didn't go away. They continued to be, in some ways, even more of a threat after Nicaea than they were before, and throughout this entire century, Arianism was a very important factor that was keeping the church on its toes. And so we looked at Athanasius. The next major character that comes in church history is Augustine, and as I say, I'm going to treat him kind of lightly today, but the bridge character, sort of the man who is the connection between Athanasius on the one hand and Augustine on the other, is this character that we know of as Saint Ambrose. He was the Bishop of Milan. He was born in 339 and died in 397. So just the latter part then of the 4th century was the era in which he had his most significant ministry. This is a mosaic of Ambrose that's found in a cathedral in the city of Milan. Many scholars think it may be a pretty accurate representation of what he looked like. You know, sometimes these portraits are a little bit stylized and you're not quite sure whether it really resembles the person in question, but I think there is a general consensus that Ambrose probably looks something like that, and so we have at least some sense of a representation of who he is. He was born in 339. He was born into a Christian military family. The Christian movement at this point did not have any particular objection to Christian people being involved in the military, and that has been generally the rule down through church history. There has been, of course, a principled Christian pacifism that has shown up from time to time, and we certainly have that in our own contemporary Christian culture. But as a rule, there has not been a, you'd say, in principle, objection to this. So this was a military family. The father of Ambrose was a military commander, and so he grew up in that particular atmosphere. And though they were Christian, there was no anticipation that Ambrose himself was going to wind up in some sort of Christian ministry. There is a myth, I think it's a myth, not everybody agrees with this, that took place when Ambrose was just an infant. And so as the story goes, Ambrose was lying in a crib and he was only a few days old, and there is, as the story goes, a swarm of bees that came in and sort of swarmed Ambrose, and the parents, of course, panicked and trying to do whatever they could, and then the bees just left. This is the story. And of course the parents were concerned, but they saw that no harm had been done. But the father, upon closer examination, noticed that Ambrose had a little bit of honey on his lips and made the observation that it must be the case that Ambrose would someday turn out to be a great speaker, a man with honeyed lips. Now, whether or not that took place or not, I'm going to leave to your own judgment. But if you ever see artwork depicting Ambrose, it's not shown here, but often is, you will sometimes see honeybees in the picture. And that goes back to this little myth. So if you ever notice that, that's the reason why. And as it turns out, the prediction was indeed the case, but whether the little story took place as reported, we're not so sure. In any event, Ambrose was educated in Rome. He was given a very fine education, the education that would be generally anticipatory of public service. Ambrose was clearly a very bright student, and so the expectation was that with the proper preparation and so on, he would become a public officer of some sort, and he did very, very well. He just loved everything that he had the opportunity to learn. This would be called in the ancient world a liberal education, a classical education. It was not necessarily a theological education. He was certainly conversant with the Christian faith. He'd grown up in a Christian home at that time, but this was more an education anticipating some sort of civil and indeed secular kind of service in the culture of that day, and he did very well in it. And as a result of that, after a few rather minor appointments, he wound up in his early 30s being appointed the governor in the city of Milan, which means he controlled Milan but also the surrounding region. It was a fairly prestigious appointment. especially for a man of his youth. And so this was really indicative of the probably wonderful career that lay before him to have this particular opportunity dropped in his lap in the year 373. Now, just to keep our chronology straight, remember Athanasius died in 373, and this is just a year prior to that, 372. So he's kind of coming in now just at the tail end of the influence and career of Athanasius. So he takes this position in Milan and conducts himself well and is pretty much well beloved by the folks who lived in that region. As it turns out, however, he only held that role for 2 years. Just 2 years later, a set of events more or less forced him into the position of being the bishop of the church in Milan. What took place was that the prior bishop who was controlling the church in Milan was Arian. As I said, the Nicene Creed did not make Arianism go away. In some ways, it actually was a springboard to even greater influence. And so there were prominent Christian leaders in the Christian world of that time who were indeed Arian, notwithstanding the Nicene affirmations. One of those characters was here in Milan. And so this Arian bishop, who'd been in that role for about 25 years, died in 374. And as a result of that, the Christian population was put to the task of finding a successor. And so you had Orthodox Christians representing the Nicene position, the Trinitarian position, and you had Arian Christians, and all of them had to get together and figure out who was going to be the successor, and it was not a pretty picture. These people did not like each other very much, and each regarded the other as heretical, And so they all got together in kind of a large arena kind of place and began to wrangle about this and haggle about it. And as they met and as they continued to try to negotiate some agreement to a successor, it became increasingly tense until there was, at least apparently, the threat of an open, violent riot breaking out between these Christians. Ambrose, being a Christian himself, of course, became increasingly concerned about this, and he was aware of it. And finally, he went up and got behind the mic, and started calming people down. And he began speaking to them. And of course, Ambrose was already a very capable speaker and communicator, not to mention sort of a psychologist. And so he's able to settle the folks down and urging them to approach this in a sensible fashion, to give a fair hearing to all sides. Ambrose wasn't necessarily leaning either direction politically at this point. He was just trying to facilitate a sensible process to get this decision of succession made. As it turns out, as the story goes, and I think there's some good reason to think it may have happened just this way, as Ambrose is speaking, a little child, sort of out in the crowd, began just chanting to himself, "Ambrose Bishop, Ambrose Bishop, Ambrose Bishop." And pretty soon there's a few others, and pretty soon there's a few others, and pretty soon the entire place is reciting in unison, "Ambrose Bishop, Ambrose Bishop." Well, Ambrose was not happy about this. This was not his training. This wasn't his plan. He was a sincere Christian. He was devoted to Christ and the Christian message, but he had never pictured himself as a Christian leader, certainly not as someone who was going to be catapulted into the position of being bishop of the Church of Milan, having had no prior ecclesiastical experience whatsoever. And so he said, "Please, everybody, this is not what you want to do." He tries to dissuade them, but the more he talks, the more becomes the insistence of the crowd, till finally Ambrose leaves. And he actually goes and hides about 3 blocks away with a friend. And he tells the friend, "Do not tell anybody I'm here." He thought maybe if he just disappeared from the radar, these people would come to their senses and move along and find a successor, and that would be that. Well, as it turns out, the crowd there, the Christian community in Milan, was so taken with the thought of Ambrose being their bishop that they sent a letter on horseback, kind of the Pony Express of the day, to the emperor, whose name was Gratian, beseeching Gratian to just simply appoint Ambrose as the bishop of Milan. And as it turns out, Gratian sent back, the letter arrived back within about 10 days of being sent, and he confirmed with joy the thought that Ambrose should be the next bishop. So at this point, in spite of his protests and misgivings about the entire prospect of being the bishop of the Church of Milan, Ambrose was indeed ordained into that position, and in 374 became the bishop. He was a man of extraordinary ability, and even though he didn't have any formal training in matters theological, he gave himself to it with a zeal that would have been, I think, impressive to anybody at any time. He was a quick study anyway. He was already familiar in a general sense with Christian teaching, Christian theology, and he sort of packed 3 years of seminary into about 2 months and just voraciously devoured all of the church fathers, all of the material that he could come across and so on, and really just in a very rapid sort of fashion was able to qualify himself then more or less academically for the job. At the same time, he adopted a conspicuously simple lifestyle. He had a fair amount of wealth already. He'd had several very successful appointments politically. He liquidated his belongings, taking seriously Jesus' instruction, go what you have, sell what you have, give to the poor. That's exactly what he did. And from that point on, he lived a quite Spartan and simple life. He was not married, never did marry. There was no celibacy vow or something like that going on. He just never did marry. But that gave him the ability to live in a quite flexible fashion. He could live very modestly and devoted his life just continually to the service of Christ in that setting. And so that became the beginning of a career that lasted for some 25 years. As it turns out, Ambrose maintained a lifelong campaign against the Arians, which might make you wonder about all those Arians that voted for him, there in Milan. But actually, his appeal was so winsome, his presentations were so compelling, that in fact many of those who had been committed to the Arian form of Christianity were persuaded and came across the line and became part of the Orthodox movement. So he was not simply a debater. He was a very winsome and attractive representative of what we believe to be the classical, correct biblical teaching concerning Christ and the Trinity and so on. And so all of that had an impact not only in Milan, but really throughout the world of his day. I'd say probably in the Christian world of that moment, Ambrose was the single most prominent, well-known, and highly regarded Christian leader. We would go from Athanasius through Ambrose to Augustine as we kind of paint that story. He also had opportunities, however, to bow his back a little bit with respect to imperial authority. The most famous incident was a moment that involved the emperor, the successor to Gratian, whose name was Theodosius. Theodosius held himself out as a Christian and may have been truly a Christian, but he was a very hot-headed man. And of course, these characters that wound up in the position of being the emperor tended to get a little bit of an ego connected with their role. You know how that is. And Theodosius didn't like anyone resisting his will or his rule. Well, on one occasion, Theodosius adopted some policies that would apply to certain cities, one of which was Thessalonica. The city of Thessalonica, the same one we hear of in the New Testament, didn't like those policies. And a riot broke out in the city in which there was an open protest against the policies of Theodosius, and Theodosius heard about it. He was in Milan at the time, and he gave a rather misguided order that Roman forces should invade that city of Thessalonica and teach them a lesson big time. And so military forces at the command of Theodosius marched into the city of Thessalonica and slaughtered about 7,000 people. Men, women, children. It was a bloodbath. It was ghastly and horrific. And it sort of shook the whole empire that here the Roman emperor, who held himself out to be a Christian, would nevertheless order or give an order that would result in that kind of horrific moment. Well, as I say, Theodosius at the time was in Milan. And Ambrose, of course, heard about this, as did everybody. The following Sunday, Theodosius came to church. He wanted to hear the sermon, take the sacrament, like everything was normal. The moment is captured for us in a painting by Van Dyck. This goes back to the 1700s, entitled St. Ambrose and the Emperor Theodosius. Oh, I wish you could see that better. I'm sorry. Can you kind of make that out? Ambrose is on the right as you're looking at it. The emperor there, if you can kind of see his face there on the left. But anyway, it looks great from here. If you want to come up and look at this, it looks very nice on my laptop here. But anyway, it's a very dramatic painting. It captures this moment. Ambrose is holding his hand out and saying to Theodosius, "You may not worship in this church with the blood of the innocents on your hands." This is very courageous. This is the kind of thing that gets people killed, you know. And Ambrose courageously resists Theodosius. Theodosius responded, "Well, King David in the Old Testament was a murderer, and God forgave him." To which Ambrose responded, "You have certainly copied King David in his murderous ways. Now see if you can copy King David in his humility and repentance." And he refused him entrance. Theodosius was furious, but he turned around and walked away, stormed away from the church door. Ambrose went inside, conducted the service. But the words of Ambrose kind of hung in his conscience, and increasingly over the next 3 or 4 days, he came to just have this sense of crushing guilt as he began to realize the magnitude of what he had been responsible for. And as he had been blinded by rage, now all of a sudden the fog began to clear. He came back the next Sunday. He had no contact with Ambrose during the week, but he came back the following Sunday. And again, Ambrose met him at the door. Theodosius said to him, "I would like to beg the forgiveness of you. I would like to beg the forgiveness of the church. I would like to publicly apologize to the gathered Christian people here, and before you and all of them seek the forgiveness of God for the horrific crime that I've been responsible for." Ambrose agreed that he should be permitted to do that. On that occasion, Theodosius got up in front of the gathered people there and gave what appeared to be a very heartfelt expression of the deep remorse that he felt for what had happened and for his own complicity in it and for the arrogance and pride that were associated with it. And all of that met with, of course, the acceptance of the church, the acceptance of Ambrose, and we assume the acceptance of God. And so that was a moment in which Ambrose, in great courage, was willing to take on what appeared to be a much more powerful political force. There's another incident involving Ambrose as well that concerned the next emperor, whose name was Valentinian. Valentinian, again, was a Christian emperor, but tilted toward Arianism, and he wanted equal opportunity religion in Milan. And so he actually sent an order to Ambrose commanding that one of the churches in Milan, over which Ambrose had authority, be given over to an Arian ministry. So he realized that Ambrose, controlled the churches there, and that by all of them at this point were within the Orthodox tradition, but he wanted one of those churches to have an Arian pastor. And Ambrose said, "Yeah, over my dead body. That isn't going to happen, And so Valentinian said, "We'll put the pastor in there by force." And he actually dispatched Roman forces to forcibly install an Arian pastor in that church. Ambrose heard about it, went to that church before they got there, barricaded himself inside it with some faithful, courageous Christians. I don't know what they did, shoved pews up against the doors, I guess, or something, And they would not let them enter. These Roman forces showed up. Of course, they had overwhelming power, but they were very, very reluctant to violently invade a church to install a pastor, And so they stayed outside. And there was a standoff for 1 week. 1 week, this church was under siege. Ambrose inside, armed with a few Christian comrades and his Bible, and all of the Roman forces outside, threatening but not moving, and finally they left. And once again, Ambrose, by virtue of his courage, was able to withstand this assault, really, as he saw it, on Orthodox Christianity. And so for these and other reasons, Ambrose is really warmly remembered. Probably the most significant and famous incident that occurred in the life of Ambrose involves his relationship to and connection with St. Augustine. I know many of you are familiar with the story of St. Augustine, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. But just to try to tie Augustine's story a little bit into the career of Ambrose, I'd like to give you just a bit, kind of an outline of Augustine. So we'll take a look at him as well. So Augustine is born in 354. He's a younger man, probably 15, 20 years younger than, is that right? About 15 years younger than Ambrose. He's born, as you may know, into a mixed family, meaning his mother was the very famous, wonderful Christian model of Christian motherhood, Monica. His father, however, was pagan. And as is usually the case, the father has a greater influence on young boys than the mother. If a mother takes the kids to church, it's much less likely to have a lasting impact than if the father takes the kids to church. That's statistically demonstrable. You all know that, don't you? Fathers have a huge impact on their little boys, on their whole family, obviously, but especially little boys. Well, in this case, that statistic held true. And though Augustine went faithfully with his mother, because he didn't have much choice every Sunday, he was much more influenced by his father, who would rather take him down to the public baths than to the church, and try to show him the seamy side of life, and try to get this young man, you see, to be sort of more pagan in his outlook. And that was really the conflict that was going on in the family into which Aurelius Augustine was born. He was a very bright student, and nevertheless, and in 370, he was educated. He'd given a formal education in the city of Carthage, which wasn't far from his hometown. I put educated in quotes here because as a teenager, he arrived in Carthage. He studied. He did very well in school, but there was more than one school he attended. One of them was an academic school, and one was kind of a school of immorality, you know. And so he was given over to licentiousness, to over drinking, to partying, to sexual escapades and that kind of thing. He describes all of this in some detail in his classic work, The Confessions, if you want to read about it. But anyway, he really does give us a pretty accurate picture of what he was going through at that point. So he receives his worldly education, in a sense, in this time in Carthage. He didn't have much regard for the Christian faith. He was an academic. He was a brilliant guy. He thought the Bible was rude, backwards, unsophisticated, not worthy of any serious attention by somebody as bright as he was, you know. And so Augustine, while he loved his mother and appreciated her concern, nevertheless just felt that he was soaring much higher than these kind of unsophisticated Christians who were popping up everywhere. And so he studied rhetoric. He became a master of rhetorical skills. He opened a school for rhetoric in Carthage. This would be the kind of education a person would get, again, if they were anticipating a life of public service. It was kind of a liberal arts education, literature, and so on, a special emphasis on being able to speak effectively and persuasively, but much more than that was involved. So Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric in a kind of private school of his own there in Carthage for about 9 years. During those years, he was involved with what's called the Manichaean Religion. The Manichaean Religion was a syncretistic religion that drew sort of contributions from several different religious strands. So they recognized Jesus as a great prophet, but they put on the same list guys like Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, and so on. All of these made the list, you see, of great religious spirits down through history, and then the Manichaean religion tried to amalgamate all of them into a kind of eclectic religion, cafeteria style, you know, that would give people a little bit of a taste of all of these good religious traditions. They were, in that sense, somewhat like, if you were to try to find a contemporary religion, something like that, something like the Baha'i faith, for example. Very similar in that sense, drawing from many different traditions and sort of putting them together in what is hopefully a non-offensive sort of religious expression. Manichaeans of the 4th century were somewhat similar to that. The Manichaean faith, however, also importantly, and this would be a distinction from Baha'i faith, was dualistic. An ultimate metaphysical dualism, meaning that in the Manichaean view, there was an ultimate force of evil and an ultimate force of good, and they were in an eternal struggle, and the struggle could never be resolved. There would always be this ongoing dualism in their cosmology that continued. So Augustine liked the Manichees because it gave him some kind of way of thinking about the problem of evil. And he'd always been riddled with the issue. I think partly because he saw it in his own heart so much. And he wondered how to account for it, and it seemed the Manichees had some sort of answer to that question that he found at least satisfying for a time. In 383, his big break came, and he was appointed the chair of the Department of Rhetoric in a school in Milan. It would be something like the University of Milan. They didn't call them universities then, but something like that. The major academic institution in Milan. And Augustine was appointed the chair of the department. So this was a big break for him. This was like his moment when he'd finally been, discovered, and he was going to be able to get on with his life in a much more respectable fashion. Nevertheless, when he arrived in Milan in 383, he was beset with all kinds of turmoil. He'd had a concubine, a live-in girlfriend now for some 10 years or so, and through her he'd had a son, and their relationship was kind of on the rocks. He had some health problems. He was deeply concerned with his own inability to control his own passions. He had become aware that he was really more of a slave to his whims. What had once been an expression of his freedom was now an expression of his bondage. You know how that is, the irony that we become trapped in the things that we thought were going to be the great expressions of our liberty. And Augustine was wrestling with all of that as he took this position. So it was not necessarily a happy time for him, even though professionally it was what appeared to be his big break. While he was there, he began to attend services at the church where Ambrose preached. He didn't attend because he was interested in the Christian faith. He still thought the Christian faith was, much less impressive than anything he would take an interest in, but he really liked Ambrose. He appreciated so much the powerful preaching skills of this man, and as a teacher of rhetoric, Augustine was sitting there taking notes, on all of the rhetorical devices he would use and how brilliantly he could put a sentence together and how persuasively he could communicate his message. But you know how it is, don't you? You start sitting under the preaching of the gospel and it begins to get under your skin a little bit. You ever notice that, And even though he wasn't there for that reason, nevertheless, the message began to worm its way into his conscience a little bit. He showed up, by his own admission, at church with an attitude. I don't know if he used that term, but that'd be the idea. He showed up kind of, pretty conspicuous by his body language and general demeanor that he wasn't really interested in the Christian faith. He was just kind of showing up out of the curiosity of the matter. And he kind of thought that Ambrose wouldn't take much of an interest in this guy who was obviously not sharing anything of that faith commitment whatsoever. But quite to the contrary, Ambrose took a very deep interest in the young faithless Augustine and took him aside and began to spend a fair amount of time with him. Later, Augustine writes of this early relationship with him, quote, "That man welcomed me as a father. I began to love him first, not as a teacher of the truth, but simply as a man who was kind and generous to me." I think it's safe to say that Augustine, whatever else he was a very lonely man. He'd become disillusioned by now with the Manichees. He had no place to land, and even though he had some outward success, this was a time of deep pain and turmoil for him on a lot of different fronts. And Ambrose was a man who kind of detected that and was able to just befriend him. And he didn't come in gangbusters, hit him over the head with a Bible, that kind of thing. He just simply was there and engaged in conversation with Augustine right at the point of his deep pain. And I think as you look at the story of Augustine later, you realize what a masterful pastor Ambrose was. Not only powerful up front, but even in this one-on-one kind of relationship with this young man Augustine, he was able to really insinuate himself into his life in a way that would be life-changing ultimately. The conversion of Augustine was really a combination of several factors, I think you'd say. One was this relationship that he had with Ambrose, which continued for some time. They would go down to the Starbucks down the street, and have a double tall decaf, non-fat mocha, and they would talk about not just Christian theology, but philosophy, the nature of evil, all of the things that were causing Augustine such pain were fair game for conversation. It's an interesting thing, and sometimes people wonder about this, but Ambrose suggested to Augustine, to help him understand the nature of evil, that he should read the writing of a man who was no Christian, a fellow by the name of Plotinus, the founder of what came to be called Neoplatonism. And oddly enough, even though Plotinus was not a Christian, reading Plotinus did have the effect of giving Augustine a better understanding of what the character of evil really is. He thought he had answers from the Manicheans. But the one thing that plagued him, and he actually asked the main leader in the world of that time, the Manichaean religion, a man named Faustus, he asked him this question, and Faustus could provide no good answer. And that was this, think about this. If you have ultimate good, and if you have ultimate evil, and they're in a conflict with each other, how do you tell which one is which? How do you know the thing you're calling good is good? And how do you know the thing you're calling evil is evil? Isn't it necessary that there be some standard, an objective, transcendent standard above both before you can distinguish the one from the other? And that's what troubled Augustine. And when he put that question deeply to Faustus, who was supposed to be the answer man, the guy could not answer it satisfactorily or even begin to. And Augustine realized that there was still some deep unanswered questions. Plotinus took this view. There is great good, there is ultimate good, and that evil can only exist because there is the prior good. You'll sometimes hear people answer the question, if God is good, how come there's evil in the world? The classic problem of evil. Our response is, unless God is good, how could there be evil in the world? How can you even denominate something in this world as evil unless you have some prior idea that there is the good? And unless that good that you are fixing your thoughts on is an eternal good, your notion of evil is purely arbitrary. You see, Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, all things are permissible. If there is no God, then the only thing that makes right in this world is might, not virtue, not transcendent truth, just the biggest stick. And Plotinus got that. Even as a pagan, he understood that, you see. And as Augustine read Plotinus, he realized not only that Plotinus was onto something, but he began to realize that if Plotinus had at least a right answer, the Christian faith had even more profoundly the right answer. And so, oddly enough, it was reading a pagan at the suggestion of Ambrose that got Augustine moving toward a better understanding of the Christian faith. He was also influenced by reading Athanasius' life of Saint Anthony. I mentioned this last week. Saint Anthony was a rather strange guy. He was sort of a hermit. He lived out in the desert, one of those characters, 3rd century. And Athanasius wrote a biography about him in which he really celebrated the discipline of this man. And the fact that in spite of the opportunities that he might have had in a sort of worldly success, he disabused himself of all of that and lived in a kind of isolated and highly rigorous, indeed ascetic kind of life. But the one thing you had to say of Antony was he was a man of great personal discipline. And Augustine read that, and it gave him such grief, because even though Augustine could have run rings around Antony academically, he was a much brighter guy, Augustine was absolutely incapable of managing his own passions. His own whims would drag him away enslaved every day. And he wondered, how was it that a guy like Antony could do what Augustine was so incapable of doing, And reading that work by Athanasius really drove that point home to him a little bit. Obviously, Monica's prayers and tears Monica famously had a conversation with the pastor that she had back in Carthage, weeping over the state of her son's soul. And that pastor famously said to her, "Can the son of such tears ever be lost?" Many mothers in church history have clung to that little statement. I want to say to you, yes, sometimes the sons of such tears can be lost. But in the case of Monica, it wasn't to be the case. And her tears and her prayers certainly followed Augustine throughout his life until eventually, of course, he did come to faith. And then there is this conversion incident. You may be familiar with it. He was out in a garden area with a friend of his named Alypius, and the two of them were sharing together a kind of deep sort of anxiety about the state of their soul. And Augustine really at this point did want to become a Christian. He just could not move himself to do it. He could not will it. He wanted to, but he felt incapable of it. And he was in this anxiety, and all of these forces in his life were sort of orchestrating themselves together to make him perfectly, exquisitely miserable, and he was weeping in a garden by himself. His friend was off in the distance. He was kind of in this little area by himself there. And he heard a child's song across the fence. And the song, well, he didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, but they were singing a little child's chant. Tella lege, tella lege, tella lege, tella lege. Skipping rope, tella lege. Very catchy, isn't it? And Augustine thought to himself, tella lege, tella. I've never heard that one before. I've heard London Bridge is falling down. I've heard eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I've heard, never heard tella lege, tella lege. Which means take and read, take and read, take and read. And so Augustine thought to himself, this must be the voice of God. And God must be saying to me to take the Holy Bible and flip it open randomly and read the first text upon which my eyes should light. This is not, friends, an approved Bible study method. But he did that. There was a big Bible. Of course, in those days, they were all handwritten copies. It was a huge Bible, and it was very expensive, but they happened to have one available there. So he went, he opened up this huge tome and dropped his eyes on the first verse that presented itself to him, and it happened to be Romans 13:14 that we read just a moment ago. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. You notice there's 6 arrows in that verse. Did you catch them? Reveling, drunkenness, debauchery, licentiousness, quarreling, jealousy. And every one of them was deeply descriptive of Augustine in his life up until that point. And they all sort of hit the mark simultaneously. And Augustine himself would identify this as the moment when faith sprang forth in his heart. And so even though he had all of these other forces going along to influence him, it was the Word of God, finally, and this particular statement that reached his heart. He was the following spring on Easter Eve baptized. This is the way they did it back then. You would have baptisms once a year. People went through a rather rigorous catechetical process, and then they would all be baptized on the day before Easter Sunday. And so Augustine, with many, many others, was baptized by his friend, mentor, pastor, Ambrose, and that took place in that very year. He returned only a couple of months later to his home in North Africa, to a little city called Hippo. Hippo is right there. It's near present-day Algeria, kind of in the region of Tunisia there, and that's where he served. It's a fairly modest little place, but it's safe to say that Augustine would have a dominating influence over the Christian world for the next several decades. He died in 430, so 30 years into the 5th century was the end of Augustine's life, and of course his influence has been monumental. It's been said that Augustine was the greatest Christian thinker of the first 1,000 years of the church's history, but many people would say he's the greatest thinker of all of Christian history, and I think probably both points could be argued pretty effectively. But Ambrose was the man behind the scenes there who had that great influence on Augustine. And with that in mind, I would like to just come back briefly to this text that we read earlier, the very text that Augustine himself came across when he opened his Bible at random. So this is here in Romans chapter 13. 3 little points. The first of them is in verse 13. Let us, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake up from sleep. So point 1, wake up. Number 2, salvation is nearer now than when we became believers. The night is far spent, the day is near. Let us then lay aside the works of darkness. The Greek there could be read, put off, lay aside, or take off, the idiom as if you were taking off clothing, to put off or take off. And then following that same kind of thought, he says, and put on the armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling, drunkenness, and so on. So 3 little points. Wake up. Now, you are not asleep. I know that. Here you are in Sunday school. I think it might be appropriate for me to say to you, wake up, because you've just been through this dull Sunday school lesson, and maybe I should kind of wake you up now, but you seem to be awake, and I appreciate that. But do we really need to wake up? Every Christian generation has lived in some sense or other at a moment of crisis. I know that if every time is a crisis, then no time is a crisis. I realize that in principle. But nevertheless, for each one of us individually, for our culture, for our church, for the moment in which we live in history, there is a sense in which we as God's people need to be wide awake. And there is this unfortunate tendency that God's people have at times to kind of sleep through it, Had an opportunity not too long ago to do a little bit of study of the moment in church history that was the run-up to Nazi Germany. And the characters there, of course, in Nazi Germany were few and far between, who as Christian people were rising up in a holy protest against a ghastly and godless philosophy, while many, many others were simply allowing themselves to be swept along. We all know this story very well now, don't we? But at the time, it wasn't so clear. And people like Barth, people like Bonhoeffer, people like Martin Niemöller, others of precious few who courageously rose up and said no to this, and yet it was as if they were trying to awaken people who were just too far asleep, didn't want to wake up. Well, I don't know. I can't say to you right now, here's the great looming crisis that we're all dealing with, but I just am saying that every one of us needs to say, am I wide awake? Am I really wide awake in this culture, at this time, in this church, in my friendships, in my family? Am I wide awake? Paul calls us, and we hear it again repeatedly in the Scriptures, wake up. So that's number 1. Let's wake up. Number 2, put off. There is a sense in which life is about what we're taking off, and life is about what we're putting on. You can't put on something better until you've taken off something not so good, And that metaphor of putting off and putting on is used repeatedly in the Scriptures. Putting off the things that take us in an unhealthy direction. Putting off the things that trip us up. Jesus says, if your eye offends you, get rid of it. If your hand is causing you problems, chop it off. He talks in very ghastly, harsh terms, hyperbole for sure. But it does give us reason to analyze. What is it in my life that's tripping me up? Later in this text, Paul will say, make no provision for the flesh. I can ask myself the question, is there a point in my life where I've made a little provision for the flesh? A little sort of something or other that I keep on the side for a rainy day, something for the flesh, Or have I adopted that rigorous, wholehearted desire to put off any of those things and really pursue a life of devotion to Christ? It's only then, really, that we can, as the final point, put on Christ. It's an interesting idea in itself, to put on Christ. Because you are Christ to somebody today. Christ is in you. And to somebody today, you are Christ. Henrietta Mears, that wonderful Sunday school teacher at Hollywood Presbyterian Church for so many years, had many great one-liners. One of my favorites is this: today you are going to meet someone who is dying for a drop of love. And what are you going to do with that person? Well, if we're not awake, we won't see them. If we aren't those who put off the distractions, then we won't care about them. But if we are those who are put on Christ, then we are that unique person who, as Ambrose was to Augustine, so you can be to that person the one who gives them that drop of love. Putting on Christ, wearing him and being Christ to that person that you will certainly meet today.